Greetings! We reveal the most sinister realities underneath the most startling atrocities. We explore a terrifying tale of obsession and power in today's episode. Tragic events follow when a police officer's obsession with an 18-year-old girl goes out of control. Come along as we explore how an infatuation became lethal and unearth the sinister aspects of this horrific case. At 18, Laker Green had her entire life ahead of her. She was working part-time at a nearby Denny's to save money for community college after graduating from Franklin High School in Livonia, Michigan. Laker wanted to work as a nurse. Her relatives characterized her as kind and compassionate, someone who was inspired by her mother's fight with illness years prior. She shared a peaceful suburban home with her father, Richard Green, who works as an insurance adjuster. When Laker met Officer James Jim Broad a few months before to her passing, her life took an unexpected turn. With 10 years of service in Livonia, Broad, 35, was a well-respected police officer. He replied to a noise complaint at her house, which is how their paths met. Friends claim that while Brody was kind and professional throughout the visit, he started a cordial conversation with Laker that eventually developed into a romantic relationship. Laker first appeared charmed by Brody's interest. After his shift, he would drop by Denny's, give her big tips, and offer to escort her to her car. They developed a love relationship over time. Brody was charming but intense, Laker told a close friend, and he frequently texted her several times a day to see how she was doing. In the summer of 2012, they began having sexual intercourse. Friends saw a change in Laker's conduct. She used to be gregarious and vivacious, but now she became shy and anxious. She frequently looked over her shoulder as though she thought someone could be observing. Rowdy became more possessive, and Laker felt stuck but didn't know how to break things up. In early August, Laker found out she was pregnant, which further complicated matters. After taking a home pregnancy test from the nearby Walgreens, she told her best friend. Neither her ex-boyfriend Cameron Hall nor the father Brody were known to Laker. Cameron's possessiveness and persistent attempts to reignite their romance after their breakup had been hallmarks of their turbulent relationship. In the days leading up to her passing, Laker was plagued with uncertainty. She expressed her worries in her journal, stating that she felt overpowered and uncertain about the future. She was concerned about Brody's reaction to the news, as she attempted to manage the intricacies of her relationships and the impending reality of becoming a teenage mother. Laker's final days were a tornado of fear and worry, since she was aware of his rage and domineering personality. In Livonia, Michigan, the late summer heat was oppressive on August 22, 2012, with temperatures circling above 85 degrees. Sharon Whitaker, a local realtor, was getting ready to show a potential buyer a foreclosed house on Arbor View Drive at 3:30 p.m. In sharp contrast to the apparently orderly suburban area, the house had been for sale for months, abandoned and in poor condition. Sharon noted a strange odor as she and her client made their way through the dark cellar. She initially believed it may be mildew or a dead animal, which are frequent in long empty houses. However, as she approached a corner, she noticed something that completely halted her. The young one's lifeless body lay on the concrete floor. Sharon saw right once that it was neither a natural death nor an accident. There were obvious wounds around the woman's neck, and her face looked pallid. There was no attempt to conceal the body. It seemed to have been left there in a hurry. The middle-aged man who was Sharon's client froze in disbelief and retreated toward the stairs. Sharon's hands were shaking as she narrated what she saw, but she was able to remain composed enough to call 911. She informed the operator that she believed it to be a homicide. "A young woman is in the basement here. She's not breathing." Although the call was short, Sharon's voice trembled as she gave the address. She and her client were waiting outside on the lawn, both of them clearly scared when the cops arrived. Later, Sharon told Detroit Free Press local reporters that it was an image she'd never forget. Police officers from Livonia were on the scene in a matter of minutes. Detectives blocked off the basement and started their preliminary investigation. Laker Green, age 18, was identified as the victim. Her hands were loosely curled at her side when she was discovered in a fetal position. She had been strangled, according to an initial assessment, and there were no indications that her corpse had been moved after death. The neighborhood rapidly became aware of the discovery, with locals congregating far away and speaking in low voices. Many said they couldn't believe that anything so horrible could occur so near to home. The tragedy was only getting started for Laker's family. The abandoned house on Arborview Drive was soon visited by the Livonia police. The investigation was headed by the covertly gay investigator Mark Calhoun, who was renowned for his meticulous, no-nonsense methods. Although he had solved many cases in the Livonia region, few were as unsettling as this one. As interested neighbors gathered around the site, officers promptly taped it off with yellow police tape spanning the front yard. Although dismal, the scene was comparatively tidy. The only obvious evidence of trauma was the bruises surrounding Laker's neck, which suggested she had been strangled. There was no blood. Her eyes were closed, her hands were loosely at her sides, and her body was discovered curled in a fetal position. Since there was no sign of a struggle, investigators speculated that her assailant might have taken her by surprise. Soon later, Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office forensic technicians showed up to gather evidence. In an attempt to find any traces of DNA, they collected samples from Laker's body and clothes. Additionally, detectives searched the house for any clues that would help them put together what transpired in Laker's last hours. A standard autopsy and toxicology test were conducted on Laker's body before it was taken to the morgue. The results of the autopsy a few days later showed something surprising. When Laker passed away, she was expecting a child. This was verified by forensic analysis, and the news further complicated the case. Because investigators found that Laker had kept her pregnancy a secret from everyone, including her closest friends, her relationships came under scrutiny after this disclosure, especially her recent interactions with Officer James "Jim" Brody and her ex-boyfriend Cameron Hall. In order to establish a motive for a murder, investigators now needed to identify the father of the unborn child. The story swiftly spread throughout Livonia once the police informed the local media of their findings. The story was taken up by the Detroit Free Press and other publications, which detailed the tragic turn of events that this young woman, who was about to become an adult and facing an unexpected pregnancy, had her life cut short. In an effort to determine how and why Laker came up in that deserted basement, detectives kept assembling the details of her last days. The town was in mourning as police hunted down leads, with many people asking what could motivate someone to hurt a young woman and her pregnant child. Police focused on Officer James "Jim" Roddy, a well-liked 35-year-old member of the Livonia Police Department, as they pieced together Laker Green's last days. Laker was the love of my life, according to Roddy, who had been upfront about their relationship. During his interrogation by detectives, Roddy denied any participation in her killing on multiple occasions, appearing calm but upset. In an interview at the precinct, he told investigators, "She was everything to me. I would never do her any harm. No matter what, I was going to be there for her." Brody gave hazy specifics about spending the evening watching Ancia's reruns, but he said he was home the night Laker vanished. Investigators, however, perceived Brody's composed manner as calculating, particularly when he appeared to exaggerate several aspects of his alibi. Investigate Brody's private life by contacting his former spouse, Karen Brody. After some hesitation, Karen, who now resides in Farmington Hills with their 2 kids, agreed to meet with police. Her description of the man who professed to love Laker was much different. During their marriage, Karen characterized Brody as domineering and easily agitated. She replied, her voice shaking, "He always had to know where I was, who I was talking to, and what I was doing. He initially gave off the impression of being merely protective, but eventually it became oppressive. He would show up at my workplace, or accuse me of lying if I didn't return his calls or texts immediately away." She also mentioned instances of physical harassment. Karen remembered times when Ruddy had punched walls during disputes or held her arm so firmly that it was bruised, but she refrained from accusing him of outright physical abuse. When she explained why she had filed for divorce 3 years prior, she stated, "I stayed for the kids, but eventually I realized I couldn't take it anymore." Concerns were aroused by Karen's remarks as well as Brody's failure to offer convincing proof for his alibi. Colleagues also told investigators that Brody was known for being unduly involved in his personal relationships, frequently to the point of obsession. In the weeks preceding her death, a number of cops reported seeing Brody park close to the Lakers area, which heightened suspicions. Brody's reputation as a trustworthy officer started to deteriorate as investigators acquired more information. Investigators understood that the deadly volatility that cost Laker her life might be hiding beneath his composed exterior. Laker Green's high school love was 19-year-old Cameron Hall. They had gone to prom together in the spring of 2012, dated for the majority of their senior year, and discussed their future plans. But their relationship was far from stable. Cameron was described by the couple's friends as possessive and incredibly passionate. He had an intense craving for sex, and his love for Laker frequently turned into obsession. Cameron's relentless sexual hunger was a major contributing factor to their breakup. Cameron would constantly press Laker for sex throughout the day, sometimes pleading for it up to 30 times a day, she told close friends. Laker felt exhausted and choked by this conduct. She broke up with him in early July, saying he didn't appreciate her lack of sexual desire. The split wasn't warmly received by Cameron. He repeatedly showed up unexpectedly to her part-time work at Denny's and sent her lengthy, heartfelt texts pleading for another opportunity. Although disturbed, Laker requested him to stop talking to her since she didn't want to make things worse. Police immediately brought up Cameron's tumultuous past with Laker when they designated him as a person of interest. A day after Laker's death was found, Detective Mark Callan called Cameron in for interrogation. Cameron seemed anxious but helpful throughout the interrogation. He admitted to detectives that the night of Laker's death, he had been playing Call of Duty on his Xbox at home. However, since no one could verify his claim, his alibi was weak. When forensic testing revealed that Cameron was Laker's unborn child's biological father, the case took an unexpected turn. During a follow-up interview, Detective Calhoun presented Cameron with this information. His response was visceral and instantaneous. "I didn't know," Cameron said, as he buried his face in his hands and started to cry. She kept it from me." He expressed a mixture of regret and remorse, claiming he was unaware that Laker was pregnant and wished she had told him so he could have made amends. Detectives questioned him about possible motivations despite his seeming sorrow. They questioned whether he would have confronted Laker out of rage after finding out about the pregnancy. But Cameron denied any role in her demise. His voice broke as he said, "I'd loved her. I would never do her any harm." Cameron's narrative contained contradictions. According to the police, especially on his actions in the weeks preceding Laker's passing, detectives were able to collect some of the text messages he sent her from her phone records. Some expressed annoyance, while others were remorseful. One person said, "If I can't bleep you, no one will." Investigators were intrigued by this strange message. As the investigation progressed, Cameron continued to be closely watched. Even though there was no denying his connection to Laker, investigators had trouble locating hard proof that connected him to the crime scene. Nevertheless, his involvement in Laker's life and demise was seriously called into question when his paternity was revealed. On August 29, 2012, Livonia police discovered crucial new evidence, which drastically changed the course of the case. An evaluation of Officer James "Jim" Browd's professional behavior was the first step. Browd had been illegally accessing police databases for months, according to an investigation of the department's systems. He had been tracking Laker Green's and her family's and friends' whereabouts using these tools. He had researched her home address, job schedule, and even information about her former lover, Cameron Hall, according to records. Because of this misuse of power, Brody was portrayed as more than just an officer who cared. It exposed a compulsive stalking pattern. Brody was challenged by Detective Mark Calhoun over this discovery. Brody was quiet at first, but he became defensive and insisted that his activities were a part of an ongoing inquiry. But his assertions were refuted by the absence of any formal case file associated with Laker. The information strengthened suspicions that Brody was responsible for her demise. At the same time, a detailed look at Laker's personal items produced another important lead. Under a pile of textbooks in her bedroom, investigators discovered a little spiral-bound diary. The entries revealed Laker's mounting anxiety. She talked of getting a string of frightening anonymous notes and feeling like she was being watched and followed. Although Laker had given a horrifying account of the notes' contents, the memos themselves were not discovered in her chamber. He said in one entry, "I'd be sorry if I didn't listen. I feel confined. I'm at a loss on what to do." The journal was sent to a forensic handwriting analyst by detectives. The outcomes were startling. The handwriting was identical to samples obtained from Richard Green, Laker's father. This turn of events significantly changed the investigation's focus. Just weeks prior, Richard, a 45-year-old insurance adjuster, had been outspoken in his displeasure of Laker's friendship with Brody, even arguing angrily with the police at the neighborhood Denny's. Investigators now had a complex web of suspects and motivations as a result of these events. The pressure Laker had been under in the weeks before her death was highlighted by the revelation of Richard's threatening notes and Brody's stalking activities. These disclosures offered important parts of the puzzle, but the case was far from resolved. Richard Green, Laker's 45-year-old father, became a key suspect as the inquiry progressed. Richard was a divorced insurance adjuster who was well known for being overly protective of his only daughter. Although Richard maintained that he was not involved in Laker's murder, information from neighbors and witnesses suggested otherwise. At a nearby Denny's, a well-known establishment in Livonia, police initially heard about a furious altercation between Richard and Officer James "Jim" Brody. A few patrons and restaurant employees witnessed their altercation on the evening of August 18, 2012, a few days before Laker's passing. Richard raised his voice and pointed at Brody during the emotional exchange, according to witnesses. He said things like, "Stay away from my daughter," and "You're ruining her life," according to one diner. According to reports, Brody attempted to defuse the situation. However, Richard's rage was evident. This dispute revealed a strong dislike between the two guys. When fresh information regarding Richard's activities on the night of Laker's murder surfaced, investigators began to fear that it might have escalated into violence. At first, Richard claimed to police that he watched episodes of NCIS on cable while spending the evening alone at home. Neighbors, however, disputed his story. Late that night, a number of people on Richard's peaceful suburban neighborhood claimed to have heard shouting emanating from his home. Detectives were informed by a neighbor who lived right across the street. It was approximately 11 p.m. "I heard shouting, the voice of a man. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded angry." During the disturbance, another neighbor reported that they saw Richard's porch light flicker on and off, indicating that there was movement within the house. Richard insisted on his innocence when the police questioned him about these discrepancies. Laker's relationship with Brody, saying it was because she was worried about her health. During interrogation, Richard told officers he was too old for her. "All I wanted was for her to see that." But when investigators linked Laker's journal to Richard's threatening notes, they became even more dubious. Their suspicion was heightened by the handwriting match and his refusal to offer a credible alibi. Richard was closely watched because of his actions and the sequence of events, even though there was no tangible proof linking him to the crime site. The matter was further complicated by Richard's erratic relationships with Laker and Brody. Even though he may have had good intentions, his actions begged the issue of how far he would go to keep his daughter safe. Police eventually discovered the terrifying truth following weeks of painstaking inquiry. Her killer was Laker Green's secret boyfriend, 36-year-old experienced police officer James "Jim" Brody. The evidence suggested a sinister combination of desperation, betrayal, and obsession. Brody's behavior on the evening of August 22, 2012, presented a somber image. Brody confronted Laker at her house because he was envious and afraid of being seen. Between his love for her, the pressure to continue being a respected police officer, and the guilt of betraying his family, he was in a downward spiral. Investigators said that Laker's unwillingness to prolong their affair and her hesitancy to cut off communication with her ex-boyfriend Cameron infuriated Brody. Late that evening, Brody cautiously avoided the neighborhood security cameras as he drove his unmarked patrol cruiser to Laker's house. Using an extra key that Laker had once trusted him with, he opened the door. Within, the altercation swiftly became more heated. Laker accused him of crossing her boundaries and demanded that he leave. She was strangled in the living room by Brody, who was overcome with anger and desperation. Brody left Laker's body in an abandoned, foreclosed home on the outskirts of Livonia to confuse detectives. The property appeared like the ideal place to hide her because it had been deserted for months. Knowing that the property had previously been foreclosed and was now unknown to most people, Brody had learnt about it through his profession as a police officer. Brody chose the residence to imply a heist gone awry and painstakingly set up the scene to make it appear as though Laker had been the victim of a random crime. Given his intimate knowledge of nearby properties, he felt that no one would inquire about a crime in such a remote, deserted house. Confident that the crime would be hard to solve, he meticulously cleaned any surfaces that could be linked to him. However, Brody's attitude proved to be a catastrophic mistake, despite his best efforts to hide his traces. He misjudged the perseverance of people looking for Laker and the police department's capacity to follow the facts. Although he believed his badge would shield him, it ultimately led to his demise. When forensic examination found a partial shoe print close to the crime site that matched Brody's department-issued boots, it was a breakthrough. Furthermore, his police car's GPS data, which put him close to Laker's house at the time of her murder, refuted his alibi. His abuse of police databases to follow Laker's whereabouts was also discovered by detectives. exposing a pattern of compulsive activity. Brody insisted he was innocent despite the growing evidence, but when he was taken into custody by the police on September 15, 2012, he dismissed it. According to witnesses, he was obviously shaken and his trust as an officer was totally destroyed, so he told cops, "You're making a mistake. I would never do her any harm." Investigators, however, were positive. Unsettling entries in his journal, which was discovered concealed in his garage, described his obsession with Laker and implied threats against everyone who stood in his way. Brody reportedly showed a mixture of regret and rage while he remained in his cell awaiting trial. The disclosure startled friends and coworkers. Residents of Livonia were left in shock, unable to make sense of the cold-blooded murderer responsible for Laker's terrible demise and the image of a dependable police officer. On March 12, 2013, Officer James Jim Brody's trial got underway in the Wayne County Courthouse, bringing the peaceful Detroit suburb of Livonia, Michigan, to the public's attention. The case's combination of murder, betrayal, and forbidden love enthralled the public. Additionally, the courtroom was crowded with media, interested citizens, and the accused's and victim's acquaintances. Diane Corbett, the prosecuting attorney, made a harsh opening argument to start the trial. She presented the proof that painted Brody as a jealous and controlling lover who could not bear the thought of losing Laker Green. Corbett brought up Brody's following of Laker, his abuse of police resources, and his frantic attempts to hide the crime. According to her, Laker's death was a premeditated act of violence motivated by fury and obsession. Paul Langley, Brody's defense lawyer, presented a completely different image. He pointed the blame at Cameron and Laker's father, Richard Green, and other possible suspects, arguing that Brody was innocent and that the evidence was circumstantial. Langley maintained that Brody's association with Laker had unfairly led to his targeting, and he charged the police department of making snap decisions. Forensic evidence played a major role in the prosecution's case. The GPS information from Brody's police car and the shoe print that matched his department-issued boots were mentioned by crime scene investigators in their testimony. Furthermore, Brody's journal, which was found in his garage, documented his compulsive thoughts about Laker and his developing fear of losing her. The prosecution's presentation of threatening messages Laker had received in the weeks prior to her death was one of the most emotional moments of the trial. Although handwriting experts testified that Brody had written the notes in an effort to scare Laker into severing ties with Cameron, Richard Green was first suspected. Brody exhibited a composed yet tense manner in court. He occasionally shook his head or muttered to Langley, clearly annoyed by the accusations made by the prosecution. Colleagues and friends characterized the trial as strange, finding it difficult to reconcile the guy accused of such a horrible crime with the once respected officer. The jury returned after several days of deliberation. As the foreman read the ruling out loud, the courtroom was silent. Brody, who had insisted in his innocence during the trial, was shocked to learn that he was guilty of second-degree murder. As the decision was given, Paul Langley, his defense lawyer, stayed composed, but was clearly dissatisfied. For a few seconds, Roddy stood still, unable to comprehend what had happened. His family, who had been there for him during the trial, watched in shock. Meanwhile, Laker's relatives brushed away their tears in silence. A hearing for sentencing was set for a few weeks later. The judge, obviously impressed by the statement, sentenced the defendant to 40 years in jail without the chance of release. The punishment was read out loud, and Brody's family listened in quiet. After having pledged to protect his neighborhood and worn a badge, the former officer now faced decades in prison. A community was shocked by the events surrounding Laker Green's untimely death. Officer James "Jim" Roddy's life changed drastically in the months after his conviction. The community he formerly served and his former co-workers were horrified, since it had been hard for them to accept that one of their own could have committed such a heinous act. After being transferred to a high-security jail, Roddy soon became the target of other prisoners. He was a marked guy in the jail system, since he had previously been a police officer. For his safety, he was frequently kept apart from the rest of society and was constantly threatened. Many people thought that Rowdy's aura of invincibility, which he had depended on during his career, would no longer shield him from the harsh realities of prison life. While incarcerated, the knowledge of what he had done to Laker plagued him. Brody apologized for his behavior, according to people close to him, but it was too late for real atonement. Far from the law enforcement profession he had once valued, he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Laker's ex-boyfriend Cameron had a complex role in the case. Police exonerated him of any participation in a murder, despite the fact that he had been involved in the inquiry because of his tumultuous relationship with Laker. Her passing upset Cameron, who had battled his own problems, such as an insatiable sexual drive that caused his relationship with Laker to dissolve. The psychological toll of losing Laker and being questioned by the police left him a broken man, even though he was never charged with any crimes. After the trial, Cameron quietly vanished from the public glare, and his life never fully recovered from the catastrophe. Laker's father, Richard Green, was also at the heart of the inquiry. For weeks he had been a person of interest due to threatening notes Laker had received, and his strange behavior during the investigation raised suspicions. But it was Brody's arrest that truly changed the trajectory of the case. Richard was never charged with any crime, though his complex relationship with his daughter remained a topic of public interest. He was not involved in Laker's death, but the emotional scars from their strained father-daughter relationship were clear. The fates of all involved were sealed in the wake of Laker's death. Officer Brody's life was over, Cameron's was changed forever, and Richard's guilt over his relationship with Laker remained unresolved. Remember to share, like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you on the following day when most have something else to do.